Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you for inviting me to your show. So happy to be here and looking forward to talking about whatever your audience wants to talk about today. And for people who aren't familiar with me, I have two books. The first book is the Genesis 6 Conspiracy. And the second one, which came out just over a year ago, is the sequel to that.
Hmm.
And the subtitle on that one is How Understanding Prehistory and Giants Helps to Define End Time Prophecy. And it has a different sort of perspective. And, I really didn't want to write book two because I didn't want to be redundant. But
Hmm.
so many Christians wanted to know more about what was in the Old Testament, even though I go very deep in book one about the Old Testament and link that into the global testimonies. People wanted more of a let's go deeper in the Bible and more from a Bible perspective. So book two is more like how the world intersects with the Bible and its chronology. And I use biblical dating there versus secular dating in book one.
Hmm.
And if people are familiar with Dr. Heiser, the late Dr. Heiser, and some of the work that he did, even though I had this research ready for book one, I didn't want to get that deep. But for book two, because they wanted me to go deeper, look at it as Dr. Heiser on steroids.
Okay.
And there are more giants in the Bible than what people can imagine. And the other thing I wanted to sort of get a better sort of sense across for people, and it's kind of a good basis for some of the things that we might get into today, is that if you really want to understand what's going on in the world today, and if you really want to understand the future in terms of where we're headed and end time prophecy, you have to understand prehistory. And there's a saying that is in both polytheism and in monotheism that is very, very similar. I'll use the one out of the Ecclesiastics one because I'm a Christian and a Christian contrarian. So I like to verify everything myself
Hmm.
as much as I can, at least. And it says, nothing is new under the sun. What was will be again. And the understanding of this only brings grief and sorrow. So that's pretty heavy stuff,
Hmm.
particularly when Jesus is talking about the end time and giving three overarching signs. One of them being it's going to be like the days of Noah, both before the flood and after the flood. Noah lived 600 years before and 350 years afterwards. So when you look at the topics that we might get into today, it's a very broad range of over like 6,000 years from an endemic history perspective.
Yeah.
And we can even get deeper than that if we want to get in that direction. But yeah, so I'm a Christian and I've authored two books. I'm working on a third and also working on a novel, not from a perspective of writing the characters and the plot, but more from providing the expertise and background information for where the characters, where their bloodlines come from, where the organizations they might be from, where they fit, and how that fits into end time prophecy.
Wow. So initially with the first book, how long did it take you to do that amount of research? Because you go really in depth. I mean, you break it down like every chapter is just packed full of information, and you
Yeah.
really you have to keep that attention as you're reading it. How long did you plan for that, and what initially like sparked that idea?
Well, I kind of backed my way into it, and there's way more years of research in there than I would have anticipated, even
Hmm.
halfway through. So from about 1980 to about 1995, 1996 was essentially biblical research. And I wanted to document all of the narratives of prophecy
Hmm.
that there are, because once I got hooked on the idea of prophecy and a book written by Hal Lindsey, The Late Great Planet Earth, was kind of scared the socks off me. I wanted to verify whether or not that might be true or how much of it might be true.
Hmm.
The only way you can do that is you have to learn about the Bible, which I wasn't very knowledgeable on. And so that took me a lot of years to document it because you got to go over it and over and over because you don't recognize what parts are prophecy and what parts aren't a lot of times until you get enough knowledge, and then you understand that there's a lot of things that have application for prehistory in a prophecy, applications for the time of the prophet, and then there's some unfulfilled prophecies that are there as well. You have to identify those and see where they fit.
Hmm.
So that so when I had done all of that, and as I was doing the research, I mean, you get to Genesis 6,
Yeah.
and it says giants and or Nephilim, depending on which translation you're reading. And then what I'm thinking when I get there is that's crazy world. That's crazy stuff. I don't know what that's all about, and I haven't become a Christian at this point, or returned to being a Christian at this point. And
Hmm.
I just said that's it was just cognizant dissonance. I didn't want to deal with it.
Yeah.
Problem is, as you're documenting the Bible, giants, tribes of giants, demons, fallen angels, preternatural events, they keep coming up.
Hmm.
And it wasn't so much the preternatural nature, it was just the idea of another race
Yeah.
that was very not, it was not settling and I wasn't ready to handle that. But at one point in time, as I started to go back through and make sure I got everything into these handwritten files. So I would handwrite the passage out under a topic and put it into a file. And the only way I could do it was that way because computers weren't used all that often in the early 80s, and I didn't have one, and I ran out of colors very quickly, and I ran out of files very quickly, and I had to keep sort of adjusting and evolving as I went. And I decided, you know what? Whatever this giant thing is and this demon thing is, I'm just going to document those and put those in another file. But again, you never get it all because you don't know what you're looking for. And a lot of times they're talking about tribes, you don't sort of relate them as giants in the Bible. So finally, after about 15 to 16 years worth of research, I decided, I have a lot of information and I have binders where I did chronology orders of narratives for prophecy, but I'm not university educated. I don't have a theology training degree. I'm not a minister. I was not on social media. I have no platform, nothing. And I want to write a book, and it's about prophecy. And so I didn't know whether I could even get published.
Hmm.
I didn't even know whether or not I could actually write a story that would make any sense, create a narrative out of it that people would want to read. And then would anybody buy it? So I thought, I'm just going to do something kind of fun because I have this really weird stuff over here on the giants. And I know there's a relationship between them, the demons, the fallen angels, and the end time because they
Hmm.
show up there. Um, and so I thought, well, why don't I write a short book and try and connect Genesis 6 to Revelation and just keep it simple, keep it short. But as I'm doing it, I'm realizing there's a lot of Swiss cheese here because there's a lot of things that people don't really connect, and so I'm leaving a lot of holes. And before I started this research, when I was younger, in the teens and even starting when I was about 5 or 6 years old, I was a prolific reader and I loved history and I loved mythology. And
Hmm.
so I said, well, why don't I put a little bit of that context in? Because Christians might want to know that the same events that are talked about in the Bible are told in other cultures all around the world,
Hmm.
but through a polytheist lens versus a monotheist lens. Not necessarily, I mean, you could look at it as a counterfeit. Yes, that's a possibility, but they seem to be distinct.
Yeah.
And they're distinct in a way that is describing the same events, but you see it through a completely different understanding in that culture. And I realized that I could put in Sumerian accounts, I could put in Greek accounts and Egyptian accounts and other cultures around the world. And then I realized, though, if I'm doing that, Christians don't know much about the culture of those polytheist nations of
Yeah.
prehistory and ancient history. So then I had to learn about their religions, which is the basis of their culture and their pantheon and their gods. And that it took several years, many years of research because you have to read the Vedas, you have to read the Quran, you have to read the Book of Mormon, you have to read the Gnostics,
Mhm.
Gospels, the Popol Vuh, all these other books around the world. If I was going to use some of their context for the prehistorical part, and then I learned that they had divided the world into four classes, which still is in effect today for the most part, although the West has created a larger middle class. You still essentially have the same class, but they're trying to shrink that middle class now. And that they only taught and educated the top two classes who thought themselves as superior, as
Wow.
the noble ones.
Mhm.
The Aryans, as Aryan is defined in Indo-Aryan, Indo-European, as the nobility. And that they wrote the history. They controlled everything throughout, and they're the same peoples as the giants. And they created these mystery schools to teach only their people, which was an extension out of the religion. And
Interesting.
that out of that came secret societies. And I didn't know anything about secret societies. So I had to go down and learn about secret societies for about 8 to 10 years because every time I got a little more information, I had more questions. And I'm saying, well, what about this? And I was absolutely shocked to see that they take their beginning back to before the flood into the descendants of Cain and the connection to giants. So,
Wow.
and you could be down there forever because it's just endless in terms of that information. So it went from 10 chapters to 100 chapters, basically.
Holy
And I
cow.
and I and I left out about 300 pages just to whittle it down to a size. So the book is,
Dang.
over 800 pages on book one. And there's over 100 pages of endnotes. So I want people to look at the endnotes and verify what I'm saying.
Hmm.
And the bibliography, I get so many comments on both books on the bibliography saying that in itself is worth the money because now we know where to go to get the 80% of the information that we want.
Yeah, I think all of that is really what sets you apart from a lot of people like in this field is like you're willing to learn about the other cultures, you're willing to add in the mythologies and kind of connect it all. I think it's super fascinating. So when you did kind of dive deep into the giants or the Nephilim, where did they come from and how did they, I guess, multiply or
Yeah.
expand?
Yeah, good question. And for Christians that are out there, this isn't taught in churches for the most part,
Yeah.
and neither is prophecy in it. And it's unfortunate because it plays such an important role to the values that they're teaching, but don't provide us the context, and they don't provide our reason for being, our raison d'etre.
Hmm.
And so this helps provide that and actually gives us the answers if we understand that. But when I'm researching outside the Bible, I decided I also would put down some pretty strict parameters so that
Hmm.
anytime that I was dealing with information that was directionally the same as what is written in the Bible, I was fine with that and showing that for additional context.
Hmm.
But clearly, to underlining that this is through a polytheist lens, and that when there was information that was departed from the Bible, I would note it. This is what that group believes, or what that religion or culture or that individual believes,
Hmm.
which is additional information to what's in the Bible. Take that for what you want, but that's what they believe.
Yeah.
So I have some strict guidelines on that, and I didn't want to manipulate what they said. I wanted to quote them directly. So even though I had a lot of their sources, I wanted to use them talking in their own words
Yeah.
so that nobody could say I took it out of context. And by the way, here's the source.
Hmm.
And then I had the sources for their sources when they were using sources. So it's verifying as much as you can. So, and what was really interesting is that once I fully understood what the Bible was talking about giants, it clicked to me everything that was being talked about in all the things I read about ancient history, prehistory, and mythology before that. They were telling the same story. And
Mhm.
it's easy to talk about the flood being in pretty much all cultures on all continents around the world. And who knows what's on Antarctica, but I expect we would find the consistency if there was a civilization there telling the information in it, maybe even providing a little bit more information.
Mhm.
And that the giants are connected with the flood in all of these accounts around the world. That's not what we're really talked about. The destruction, the catastrophes are talked about, but they never come out and say it's identical to the flood story that's in Genesis 6.
Mhm.
And that's part of the hidden sort of information. And there's so much hidden history because understand, and for context, as what I'm talking about is that it is the giants that rule the upper two classes throughout our history, and they control the history. And they keep whatever they want from us as that secret hidden history behind, you know, very strong vaults because they control every aspect of our society and
Mhm.
have done so for very long. So there's a relationship, an intimate relationship with giants and humanity, and they were created for a purpose. And what's very surprising, and not once you start to understand the larger point of view, but when you get into it, is that the identical same story is told all around the world. And the basic story is the gods, fallen angels, as we would understand them biblically, the ones who rebelled from God, the Nephilim, fallen ones, who created the giant ones. Nephilim, I am is the male plural, and understood in ancientology as the majestic prefix for a royal bloodline from the gods or demigods, as we would understand that in ancient terms, offspring of human females and the gods, or human males and goddesses in the polytheist culture accounts. And that when we look at the sons of God going to the daughters of men in Genesis 6, this is the same story that's told everywhere else in the world. And so if we look at um, probably one of the most popular science fiction mythos, ancient prehistory mythos, legends, whatever you want to call it, Atlantis, you have the Olympian god Poseidon, god of the sea, going to a female named Cleito, produces 10 demigod giants to rule over the empire of Atlantis that's destroyed by the flood.
Wow.
You cannot get a more identical account in one quick sentence, which is why I like to use it because it encapsulates everything that had the Atlantean religion of magic, which is the antithesis to the worship of the God of the Bible that the Sethians worship, but the Canaanites also worshipped the same religion as the Atlanteans because according to at least the biblical account, as you understand the details and then clarified with the context of the Gnostics and the polytheists, is that the polytheist religion begins with Enoch, son of Cain,
Mm.
which is the same religion as the Atlantean religion. It's part of a branch off of that sort of a religion. I like to call it Enochian mysticism. It's better understood before the flood and after the flood in Indo-Aryan terms, giant terms in their language, as Zoroastrianism.
Wow.
And so all of a sudden you have this nexus point, and then you start looking around and you see, well, these heroes and giants in Sumeria are created in the same way. You go to China and the dragon creator gods create uh, their demigod kings in the Shah dynasty that we see show up after the flood in the same way. And that all of a sudden you realize that the pantheons around the world seem almost identical, just different vernacular names. And now you're seeing this sort of common history. So the giants in all cultures around the world are the spurious offspring of the fallen angels or the gods. And they're creating these giants to do the dirty work. In other
Mm.
words, they know how powerful the God Most High is. I don't think they ever thought they could defeat them in their rebellion, but they're looking for a realm on their own, just as Satan rules over the council of gods, at least for a little bit longer, and the pantheon of gods would be the council of the gods underneath Satan, and that Satan was trying to raise his throne to be like God in heaven when he rebelled and with the rebellious angels. We don't know the exact number of how many angels rebelled. We know there's a full third of them that will have rebelled by the last 7 years, as they're counted at the midpoint in the war in heaven in Revelation 12. And we also know that we get a number of 10,000 times 10,000 loyal angels. Could be an allegorical number, but it's cited twice the same way in Daniel and in Revelations. And that would be 100 million around the throne of God, which means there's got to be, no matter how you do the math there, if there's a third that have rebelled, at least 33 million and maybe 50 million, depending on how you want to divide that up. So a lot of fallen angels, and not all of them are in the pit prison for their crimes for creating the giants. So they create the giants to enslave humankind and to lead them into destruction and rebellion against God, so they will be wiped from the face of the earth and remembered no more.
So from there, I guess biblically breaking it down, where does that kind of like lead throughout the Bible and kind of
Sure.
and through different eras of history?
Yeah, so we get giants both before the flood and after the flood.
Hmm.
And the first creation of giants biblically, although there will be a lot of Christians that might say that giants were created before and with the serpent seed doctrine, although that's through a lot of allegorical interpretation that creates a lot of conflicts as you take that downstream into the Bible, which is, I'm not against Cain being the son of Satan and Eve. I just can't get there sort of biblically. And
Yeah.
so, as we understand the clear understanding of giants showing up, and also understand that Cain being a giant is also a polytheist doctrine.
Hmm.
Okay, so that's another red flag for us
Hmm.
as Christians. But who knows? It may be possible, and it doesn't matter whether he was giant or not to me because evil is evil. So
Yeah.
it's the same sort of end. So the giants are created in Genesis 6 verses 1 through 4 in the preamble to the flood story. And if you're not familiar with this topic, nobody will tell it to you in that way because they don't want you to understand that the creation of the giants is the context for the flood story,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
And it is the violence that they bring, and not just violence as you've been brainwashed to in schools and in churches to believe that it's with just swords. They're receiving the angelic technology, and they're doing things with this knowledge that we're just catching up to this day.
Wow.
And so that's the violence part. And so they had the ability to destroy the world by fire. And I think that's why God intercedes with the flood. And what's interesting is with the Gnostics and the Polychronicon accounting of Masonic history,
Hmm.
which I mentioned take their beginnings back to the descendants of Cain and the creation of giants.
Yeah.
They had all of this knowledge that they didn't want to get lost. We would know that as the archives of the Masons, the emerald tablets, the pearls of wisdom, the golden apples. There's a myriad of allegories for this bank of knowledge, but this knowledge was hidden in their accounts underneath the Great Pyramid in 9 vaults and 365,000 or 36,525 books. Again, a solar number. So we got some allegory that's in there as to what they're getting at with that. But that knowledge was provided directions to on two pillars. One
Hmm.
that could survive a flood so it could float, and one that could survive a destruction by fire. Because they didn't know which catastrophe was coming. They only knew through the information coming from Enoch, son of Cain, versus Enoch, son of Jared. There's two Enochs in the biblical genealogy, so they get conflated all of the time.
Hmm.
And we need to make a distinction between the two. And they didn't know which one was coming. So, and as God had, provides for us for a passage in 2 Peter 3, is that this destruction by fire that was there in the beginning, which is another rabbit hole but that I'm not going to go into right now, is reserved for the end time. So it would appear that God permitted the flood or authorized the flood, depending on what your perspective on that is, because it's the gods of the pantheon that bring the flood in all the polytheist accounts. But yet you're brainwashed to say by the polytheists that the God of the Bible is evil because he brought the flood.
Yeah.
So did he actually do it? And did the polytheist accounts just want to take credit for doing it to show how powerful they were to wipe out humankind because they were too noisy and their offspring that became too evil? Or did God permit them to do that, but there was going to be destruction that was going to happen?
Hmm.
Um, it doesn't really matter, but just so that people don't allow wedges to be put into your faith, because the polytheists are experts at taking scripture and making you feel uncomfortable with it at times.
Yeah.
So what they're trained to do. So when we look at this destruction by fire, that's part of the technology that they had the ability to do.
Hmm.
And angelic technology has planet destruction capability. And we see that throughout polytheism with the weapons that they had. And or in the Vedas, where you see that actual war of the gods. It might actually be an ancient depiction of the rebellion of
Wow.
fallen angels.
Yeah.
And so we also learn that, and this is directly related to the Nephilim and the knowledge, is that everything on the earth was corrupted. That's the Hebrew word shakath. That means to pervert, to
Hmm.
ruin, to destroy, to decay. That means everything was perverted for the most part, including all flesh. So that means the DNA of humans, DNA of animals. That means the plant genomes. It doesn't talk anything about the earth, just what was or in the sea, but what was on the earth was all corrupted.
Hmm.
And so that takes a technology. So when we talk about this ancient technology and nothing is new under the sun, and I use the term we're just catching up to that, you start to see how it starts to fit in and how it's going to be like the days of Noah, and that this destruction by fire is reserved for the end time. So the flood is designed to give a restart for humanity. So everybody with their names in their book of life have an opportunity to leave their name in that book of life that was created from before creation or have it blotted out. So we have a choice to choose God or not. And a lot of people think, well, that means all the giants were wiped out and they didn't survive the flood. I lean in that direction as well, but they could have also survived the flood. And we get that in all the different polytheist accounts. And biblically, we can get there in Genesis 6 and 7, where it says God was only going to destroy everything he created. He did not create the giants. That was the fallen angels through using human females from the biblical perspective to create the Nephilim giants.
Hmm.
So biblically, we're not told how they actually show up after the flood, although I think we get an indication in Genesis 6:4, where the sons of God went to the daughters of men and did so again. As we take that back to the Hebrew in like manner. So
Hmm.
same type of creation versus survival, but we don't have that smoking gun verse
Yeah.
that says it happened again uh, as it did before the flood. So we have to be a little bit open. In the polytheist accounts, they're surviving on different arcs. They are surviving in underground cities. They are surviving off the world in clouds, in other dimensions. And the fallen angels, who still had free will and choice, as they're indicting themselves, are going to save some of their original offspring as it's accounted for in polytheism. And Sumerian and Greek accounts will also talk about the giants that were before that were destroyed in the wars. We'll talk about some that survive, whether it's at a Tartarus or on an ark. And they'll also talk about a second incursion as well. So they're talking about both. And the Epic of Gilgamesh actually has both in it.
Wow.
So when you have Gilgamesh and Enkidu created from the female goddess Nin, a bull god, fertility goddess, that's after the flood, 6 generations after the flood, when Gilgamesh is born from King Lugalbanda of Uruk. And Enkidu is created in the same way, and he's two-thirds god, one-third human. That's a second incursion account. But Utnapishtim, the Sumerian Noah, and all of his family are also two-thirds god, one-third human, and they're the ones who populate the ark in the Epic of Gilgamesh flood story. So we have a survival story in there and a second incursion. And just as Hesiod talks about the giants that were destroyed in the Great Wars, and then the second race of giants were created at some point later, that's again something that you get sort of similar around the world as well. So we have to be open to both. And biblically, we only know that they show up, but not as Nephilim, but as Rephaim.
Hmm.
And people will say, well, no, no, Numbers 13:33, it says the Anakim giants were sons of giants, Nephilim, as you take that back to the Hebrew. But that trouble is that's in the embellishment part of the report from the spies. Did Caleb and Joshua report giants? Yes. And did they report Anak? Yes. But they did not report Nephilim.
Hmm.
And when we get the major grouping of giants in the promised land proper, um, we get the Anak or the Anakim. That goes back to the Hebrew word Rapha or Raphaim. So we get giants that show up immediately after the flood as Rephaim. And the first reference to giants or Rephaim specifically is in the War of Giants in the time of Abraham in Genesis 14, where you have these giant kings and their armies coming into the covenant land of giants. And there's, it's a geopolitical war of major proportions very, you know, shortly after the flood.
Hmm.
And so you also get the Rephaim tribe that shows up in the land that Abraham is going to be gifted for his descendants, Israel, in Genesis 15. And there's other giants and hybrid giants that are listed in there. So what we do know is the Israelites recognized in that Numbers account that there were Nephilim because the term is used there, and that they're trying to scare the Israelites and gives veracity to these beings that were created in Genesis 6,
Hmm.
and that the Anakim were also giants, but distinct. Maybe not quite as large, but giant nonetheless. Maybe not quite as many gifts from the gods passed on, but distinct for sure. And so we also have other tribes that are listed biblically that would be associated with the Rephaim, like the Emim, like the Horim, like the Avim, like the Anakim, like the Amalekim, and more, Zamzuzim, Zuzim, and then there's a whole bunch of other ones that people don't even recognize as possibly being giants, like the Gesherim or the Makathim, that I get into. And in book two, I'll actually take these giants back, or these tribes back to the giant patriarch, that many of the tribes are named after, from, patriarchally, and take it eponymously as the tribe's name. And some of them might even be similar to a name of one of the gods of the Baalim Council,
Wow.
and take some of those back to those gods in book two. So when we look at giants, we have other giants that show up after the flood in great numbers
Hmm.
and in multiple locations, and not just in the land of the covenant. And so they're understood as the aboriginals, that the people of Babel, 100 years after the flood, will migrate into those lands and intermix with.
Like along like with the textual evidence, do you find like any architectural evidence? I've seen Graham Hancock's show where it's just architecture built within mountains that seem like
Yeah.
it's meant to kind of last through a sort of flood or through like a catastrophe, kind of like you
Yeah, you see
explained.
you see architecture that is unexplained, and remains unexplained in terms of why would you build Petra that would be, 80% underground versus
Yeah.
what we see above the ground, which is a
Hmm.
wonder in itself. I mean, Gobekli Tepe is another one. There's other locations. Um, the deeper and the longer things go, we learn more about architecture with these, and these aren't small doorways through. These aren't,
Yeah.
they're made for very large people to go into.
Hmm.
Or you have these huge steps
Yeah.
on architecture, and you have these huge gates and doorways in old architecture that's, not underground. You see all sorts of architecture around the world that's designed for people much larger than humans. And you might say, well, that would be just for the gods because they would be even bigger. So, yes, you will see reliefs where you have three different groups of people. And you could, because we don't have a text underneath to explain what they're talking about, you could imagine those as gods, giants, and humans, or you could imagine them as giants, hybrid humans, and humans.
Hmm.
Either way, we're still talking about beings that are much bigger than the smallest beings, right? And so, if we understand that the giants, both before and after the flood, once they're created, because of their great size, are able to easily overwhelm humanity. They were beings that were created for war. They are great warriors. They are ambidextrous. They are fast. They are huge. They have a uh, height to width ratio of 2 to 1 versus 3 to 1 for humans. So 50% wider. So when it talks in biblically about beings as being stout in the KJV, that's what it's referring to, not as in fat, but as in muscular. They were built more like a WWF wrestler or a lineman. They were that strong and bulk and wide. And that they had strength that we can't even imagine. When we look at the giants in terms of how they're being described in the Old Testament, as we take that word mighty back to Hebrew, uh, etzem, and it's spelt a couple different ways, but it goes back to describing how powerful they were. They had the ability to crush bones with their hands.
Hmm.
They're, I mean, can you imagine just grabbing a human and crushing them within the hand? I mean, it's crazy. So we get some allegories, and again, this is an allegory or a simile, and it is probably hyperbole at the same time. But the Israelites describe themselves as insects or grasshoppers compared to the giants that they saw in the covenant land.
Yeah.
So you can say that that's hyperbole, fine. I get that. There is some of that in there, but what they're communicating in that hyperbole is they are so much bigger than um, than the Israelites that they're like monsters, and they had elongated skulls. So monstrous skulls, and not just an elongated skull through wrapping a child at childbirth, but the
Hmm.
volume was huge, right?
Yeah.
You can't increase the volume when you bind a skull, and you can't get rid of the sutures. They're sutureless. Human skulls have sutures. And they had these huge, large wraparound eyes that would light up a room, and they had voices that would just be like an amplifier. It would just make things vibrate. It was so deep, and they looked like their parents. So whichever kind of watcher produced them, they would have traits to look like that. So that's why you have gods and kings related to reptilians, to cobras,
Hmm.
um, within the imagery of royalty. That's because they come from the seraphim dragon angels, serpent-faced angels,
Wow.
who produced most of the watchers. And that, in the time of Josephus, they, and this is the time of Jesus, they still kept these bones on display that the Israelites fought against. And these are likely smaller than the ones before the flood. and the ones that are being described in Josephus are ones that were captured around Hebron, which is Kiriath Arba, the city of Arba, the parent patriarch of the Anakim giants that are described in Numbers 13:33. And they kept those bones on display, and they don't even look like human anatomy. They're so much bigger and different in terms of how they were engineered
Hmm.
to hold that size of body strength. So, how big were the antediluvian giants? Some people think as much as 300 to 500 feet tall. If you take one translation
Wow.
of the book of Enoch as 300 cubits, although the Giez version uses 300 ells, and ells is the older term. We don't know the dimension of an ell, so I'm not thinking they were that large.
Hmm.
But sort of the consensus that you get through the research is somewhere between 20 and 40 feet tall.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
if they were a 2-to-1 height ratio, even if they're only 20 feet tall, that's going to make them 10 feet wide,
Yeah.
right? And so the post-Diluvian giants are a little bit smaller. So if we get like King Og's bed, that was iron because it wouldn't hold his weight, and it was kept on display after they defeated King Og in the city of Rabbah, so that the future generations of Israelites would never confuse or diminish the challenge that they had in fighting against the giants. And
Yeah.
so it was 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. And he's king of Ashtaroth and Edrei and Ugarit. I mean, Ugarit actually means, if you use Kiriath, which is the word for city, Ug, which is, comes from UWG, is the transliterated English, or OWG from UWG. Um, and Arit, which means mighty ones,
Hmm.
um, as and or terrible ones, as it's translated in Ezekiel 32 to describe these beings, or in Isaiah 25. That would be the city of Og the Terrible One before he moves to Bashan, Mount Hermon, and sets up his capital city after the War of Giants, after most of the Rephaim wiped out. And he's the last of the Rephaim, last of the giants. Um, and how we understand that is either he survived as before the flood, or he's the last of the original giants that were produced in the first of the second incursion after the flood. And so he would have been a king, and he was King Og. And Josephus says you measure that on a royal cubit versus a common cubit. So 21 inches versus 18 inches, which would make that bed 15 to 16 feet long, and it would make that, and it was 4 cubits wide, so that was going to make it 9 feet, um, make that 7 feet wide. Um, and
A little
so
bit
he's going to
bigger
have
than a
to,
California king.
yeah, a little bit bigger than a California king, yes. And so
Wow.
Og's going to be somewhere between, say, 14 feet to 12 feet, depending on the cubit you want to use, but somewhere in that sort of range.
Hmm.
And so the thing is about that bed that they were also portraying, that is the height to the width ratio of the giant as well.
Hmm. So one thing I've kind of heard often described with the Nephilim, along with the elongated skulls, or maybe six fingers on each hand. Is that a thing that you came across?
Well, I mean, Josephus describes that, and we also get one account in the Bible that references a giant in the time of David who had, 6 digits on each of its hands and feet. That's the only biblical accounting that we have.
Hmm.
And Goliath isn't described as having 6 digits, and his four brothers aren't. This is another giant,
Hmm.
but distinct.
Yeah.
And it seems to be a separate race, or maybe it's a separate trait that was starting to disappear. Except that if you look at some of the archaeological evidence with the skulls that were discovered in North America that are
Hmm.
more recent than even the time of Goliath, you have 2 rows of teeth, for example,
Yeah.
that you're talking about. So this could be a specific line of giants, or if, maybe several lines of giants. There are 200 watchers in the first incursion that produced giants.
Hmm.
and they would all produce tribes with each of those individuals as being a patriarch. So there's multiple lines of the giants, multiple bloodlines. And
Hmm.
so I'm careful not to, because they don't have scripture for it, to say that all the giants had
Yeah.
that many teeth, that many rows of teeth.
Hmm.
But we do get one giant that was specifically identified because of that unique nature. I think that's inferring that some of the giants had that, but not all of them.
Interesting. So, you mentioned the technology that they had. Where did they get that, and can you describe some of it?
Sure. So in the beginning, from a biblical perspective, and this is a similar story that's told in polytheism, particularly amongst the Gnostics, is Cain is the son of Adam, who is ostracized for killing Abel, and he rebels. Now, Cain in the polytheist version learns knowledge from Adam, his father.
Mhm.
And of course, Cain is born after Adam and Eve are kicked out of the Garden of Eden for eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, this garden is a very understated term because the description of it has it going from the Nile to the Euphrates to Mount Hermon to the basically the Red Sea, Sea of Aquaba, and that connects into as you go further south and east into the Indian Ocean. So it's all of that land, and you have Adam created to put into this garden to manage. So that's an impossibility to do it without technology. Even when God adds Eve, because no suitable partner could be found, which is interesting language in itself.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, but this knowledge is understood as knowledge of that's used for good versus evil, and to be used that way. But knowledge can be used either way, and that's the issue when you're going to eat from that tree. You've been given all of this knowledge, but now you're going to apply it not to worship God, not to honor the God of the Bible, and do all sorts of horrible things that humans end up doing it. So after and to be able to run that size of agrarian project that has orchards in it, as you take that language back to the Hebrew, raising all sorts of grains with the grasses that are talked about in there, um, raising different types of domesticated animals. This is an agrarian rooted um, technology, and you would need knowledge of astronomy, of the seasons, of other things to be able to manage that much with just two people.
Hmm.
And so afterwards, Adam is teaching this knowledge to Cain, Abel, and then Seth. And then Cain develops this knowledge a little bit more. And after he has his son, Enoch, Enoch is the one who takes this knowledge, develops it into the seven sacred sciences that they called it. We would understand that as the seven liberal arts today,
Hmm.
and develops an initiatory oath-based religion to honor the pantheon of gods. And that he's going to continue to develop this knowledge through the religion, through the upper class, and then they're going to supply daughters to the angels that they worship to create this super race.
Wow.
And then you also have that merges with this is the knowledge of fallen angels that takes it to a whole new level. So how would you sort of describe that in terms? Well, we have a development of the seven sciences since Babel that's very slow. It takes forever to make advancements. And all of a sudden, in the last 20 to 30 years, we are expanding that development at
Hmm.
unprecedented levels that would be like the days of Noah, and that knowledge is coming from the gods.
Wow.
And so, how great is this knowledge? It has the ability to do DNA manipulation, which is why we see chimera animals talked about in polytheist legends. King Hababa of the Cedar Forest has multiple animal parts. This is technology above what we're doing today to create those things. And they had the ability to destroy the earth by fire, which we now have as well. But I would suggest that the weapons that the giants had available to them were even more powerful than what we still have today, or at least what has been revealed to us. And that they had the ability to build architecture we cannot build today. No matter
Yeah.
how they try and say we might be able to do it, they cannot do it. Otherwise, they would do it.
Yeah.
And they have no way understanding of how that they put in the sacred geometry, the celestial alignments, the earth ratios, perfect masonry, using weights and sizes of stones that we can't move today,
Yeah.
let alone do the same quality of masonry. So this knowledge is held within the legends and mythology of the polytheist cultures. Now, there's allegories in it. That's part of that writing style, but they understand what polytheists at the adept level, they understand what is allegory and what the true meaning is.
Hmm.
And typically, when they're allegorizing things, they're kind of dumbing it down to a certain degree and not showing the full extent of that power and technology.
Yeah, so would that play into what's kind of like the technology and the bloodlines trying to be kept within kind of the reasoning for some of these secret societies to kind of keep it tight and I guess to themselves?
Yeah, so they want to keep it tight because the knowledge has the ability to destroy the earth. They call it the absolute. And whether or not they had it right from the beginning, they certainly had the ingredients of part of it to get to that sort of level. And they're reserving that knowledge and development of technology um, until the end time. And they want to bring it out with all of its bag of mystical tricks in the end time because they're trying
Mhm.
to cattle herd the world, humans, into a certain direction.
Yeah.
So I think they may have had pieces of that information, but I think there's been a lot of things that have happened throughout history that knowledge has been watered down,
Yeah.
lost. But they certainly have within their mythos this guardian aspect of protecting this ancient knowledge and hidden in multiple areas in the world that they intend to bring out in the end time.
Hmm. So, going into Enoch and I guess, some of these secret societies throughout histories or different eras of histories, like I guess the Rosicrucians and like starting, so I mean, I assume like around the Queen Elizabeth age, what do you think about John Dee? What are your thoughts on John Dee and evoking the Enochian language, and who do you think he was like talking to during that time?
Yeah, so he was Rosicrucian, and he was part of the nobility. He may be a little bit more distant. He's not royal pure, let's say, as what Queen Elizabeth would have been.
Hmm.
But he was the most powerful individual in England next to the Queen.
Wow.
And if people haven't heard this before, his code name was 007 in His Majesty's, Secret Service, right? And
Hmm.
he was a spy that would go into Europe. But he was a master alchemist, master. So Rosicrucian, and he would be part of the bloodline. So he'd be part of the upper level of the Rosicrucian order. And he would have had a degree that was higher than what a Masonic or a Freemasonic adept would be, which is third degree on the old system, 33rd degree Scottish Rite. Same level, just split it 11 different ways.
Hmm.
And so Rosicrucian, he's going to be 7, 8, 9 minimum. And who knows how high that old goes. Some people say 33, some people say 100, but um, 33 is more of a number that seems to resonate with me in terms of than my deducing here would be the level.
Hmm.
Because again, even if you were to split that 11 ways through the Scottish rate, you still get to a big number that's over 300. So
Yeah.
um, 33 is probably closer, but unless you're part of the Royale bloodline, then you won't know. what the highest level of adepthood is, but he would be up there high. And when he's talking about using Enochian language and Enochian knowledge, he's saying somehow, some way, he has some access to that bank of knowledge that was stored underneath the pyramid, discovered by Hermes, taken to Nimrod, who was the first grand master of masonry after the flood, writes its first constitution after the flood for inheriting that knowledge, and is recognized as so within the craft, within the secret societies. So he had somehow access to this as it comes downstream through history. How much of it, we don't know, but a lot more than what history would sort of tell us.
Hmm.
So he is a considered probably the most powerful magi of that time, at least of the Western Europeans. It's kind of the furthest I've been able to take his level of understanding. And then he trains Francis Bacon as his apprentice, so to speak, using their language. And Francis Bacon will replace John Dee and become the most powerful, second most powerful person in the reign of Queen Elizabeth, and then holds that position after Queen Elizabeth dies and King James comes down from Scotland to take over the throne. And so that's the King James, of course, that would be involved with the King James Bible, as most people are familiar with it.
Hmm.
So you have this heavy Rosicrucian secret society influence amongst the royals because the royals control the secret societies. And as the modern ones are developing after the fall of the Templars, which was a central organization mostly of royals at the upper level, they're going to have multiple organizations, and so it'll eventually split away from the Templars before the Templars fall and into another order that was there before, but it was considered the senior order, and will carry on with the Rosicrucian Red Cross imagery, and then that will dilute itself down to, because that's originally when we see the Rosicrucian order of the invisible ones, there was 33. So we would recognize that as the Council of 33 with 13 Western families at the top. And then you would have had as this original 33 of Rosicrucians expands down, you're going to get the Committee of 300 Families and then the Rosicrucians. So when you look at the Grand Masters of like the Priory of Sion, which would be that higher senior order of royals that split away at the cutting of Elms in 1188 after the fall of Jerusalem, you're going to see that go from people like de Guizer and Sinclair and St. Clair's and other royals into more educated elite. So people like Bacon, people like Da Vinci, people who are more associated with the seven development of the seven sciences. That's the lower order you're seeing being
Hmm.
developed of the Rosicrucians. And that's who Francis Bacon is part of and writes the New Atlantis.
Hmm.
Um, and again, we're talking about two individuals that had significant power between Dee and Bacon over the two monarchs with the development of the English and Commonwealth Empire.
Yeah, Francis Bacon is a super fascinating person to look into historically. How involved was he with the translations of the King James Bible?
Yeah, so he's the final editor, and he's the one who creates the English language. As we understand it, that's going to be used for the KGV. It's going to be the first major project. And so what Francis Bacon does is he creates two writing groups. One is called the Knights of the Helmet, and the other one is um, the Spear Shaker Society. And the spear shaker was Apollo and Athena, who had the spear as a weapon that they would shake but they were also sponsors of the sciences and the arts. And so he's developing two writing societies, whom Shakespeare is part of. And now you start to see why some people say, well, what's going on with the name of the society? Francis Bacon, and is he the same as William Shakespeare, who was uneducated, who wrote some of the most famous polytheist writings on the planet?
Yeah.
Um, and how would he got that knowledge? Well, Bacon would have had that, but whether he's Shakespeare or not, there's a relationship there.
Hmm.
And he's created these two societies to create the new language, to take it from Middle English to a new English that would be more of a world Babel language in the image that they want it to be. The end time is going to be like Babylon, as we understand that, that comes just before Antichrist, and the universal religion with Babylon is rooted in the word is rooted in the word Babel in Hebrew. Okay. So it's going to be like Nimrod's Babel, one language before the confusion of the language. That's the language that they want to create, which is the modern English language. And he has them writes all has these playwrights write entertainment, but they're only going to write entertainment for about their own belief system,
Hmm.
about their own religion, about their own ancestors. And they're going to keep their history and their religion and their belief systems alive in it. That's why you have so many mystical things that are in Shakespeare. Like if you go into Midsummer's Night Dream, you got fairies, you got elves, you got all sorts of things that are going on. And the rest is about the royale history for the most part in terms of who he writes about.
Hmm.
So this is the language that has been developed, and when King James takes over, is going to say, "I want to bring in a English language that everybody is going to use, including Scotland, including Ireland as part of Great Britain,
Hmm.
and that I want to unite the empire that I'm building um, with this Bible." It's going to help me solidify and take care of a lot of religious strife that's going on. There's a lot of groups, whether it's pilgrims, whether or not it's the Catholics, there's a number of groups that are at odds with each other. So he's going to do what Constantine did with Christianity to unite the religion, where he united the polytheists with introduction of some Mithraism, which is a branch of Zoroastrianism, with uh, the 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 religion of Christianity, and create this homogenized imagery, which is why we have all of these polytheist symbols within Christianity. And he models that after something that King Shapur did, let's say that 500 years before that in Persia, where he used Zoroastrianism to do the same thing to unite the Persian Empire. So this is the model of the royales. It's
Hmm.
part of, and King James sees him as an antichrist type figure. And so he's going to be involved in this in certain ways, and he puts his right hand man to oversee it, and who's going to do the last editing of it. So when we see some odd things in the King James Version translation, like unicorn,
Yeah. That's one
that's
thing I
the
was gonna bring
influence.
up. Yeah, I've
Yeah,
got a young daughter, and that's one
yeah.
thing I was like dying to bring up was the unicorn. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
So the unicorn is used several times, and the word should not be translated as unicorn. I mean, the word Hebrew word is rem, which means a wild bull or an ox. And but in the KJV, that meaning is translated many times as unicorn. And it's used in relationship to interesting applications related to Mount Hermon, in association with it, where the giants were created. It's used in the prophecies for the end time for Ephraim as this unicorn that gores the nations. And he sees himself developing this commonwealth through the vision of Francis Bacon and John Dee. That's their vision of what they want the English Empire to be. And that Antichrist in the book of Daniel is this little horn that rises in the end time, a unicorn. So you can't get any more blatant than that. So a lot of people say, well, unicorn, well, so it's just allegory. Well, he has a unicorn on his coat of arms.
Yeah.
And that's heraldic taciturn language for an angelic being. And so typically most people say, well, a unicorn was this cute, cuddly little being that was so playful it didn't hear its calling to go on the ark, right? Because they were just having fun. Well, that's not true because only clean or unclean, not clean animals. I don't want to get confused with the spiritual aspect. Uncontaminated with DNA animals were called to the ark because God knew which ones were not um, contaminated to restart after the earth. So he wanted to wipe out all of that DNA manipulation that was going on and from that technology that we talked about. And he calls
Mhm.
all the animals. So the unicorns didn't make it to the ark because they were not called. Now, why is that? Well, they weren't these tiny little, cute little cuddly unicorns that we get in the fairy tales. They were the horses that the Nephilim before the flood rode into battle on. And then they designed a
Damn.
horse like this after the flood for the Rephaim giants. So that when we see these great white horses that are used from in Austria for these Lipizan horses, they're sort of descendants of this great white horse that was designed for the giants. And these great white horses were used, like particularly as it's seen in some of the movies, like with the 300, you have this giant Persian king because the beast empires were all giants. Um, and they have these huge white horses um, that were pulling this chariot for the Persian king.
Hmm.
And so we have some sort of DNA manipulated thing that's created by the Indo-Aryans after the flood, and they become masters of the horsemen. All the Indo-Aryans, all of the Scythians, are all the same people who were masters of the horse and the chariot. And they invent the chariot after the flood.
Wow.
And this horse, it was so big it could take a giant that would be even taller than King Og. I mean, we get one description of a giant that's a dark-haired giant after the flood with Gilgamesh. Now, he may inherit this mythos from the antediluvian side in history because it's common for gods and heroes and kings to inherit not only names but the mythos that goes with it in
Hmm.
terms of the position that they have. But he's described in not only the Ugaritic text but the Sumerian text as being 11 cubits tall and 4 cubits wide. So he is 7 feet wide and 19 feet tall. And so if that's the post-diluvian one, that's the biggest I have as a benchmark for a post-diluvian, because most of them are like in Greek mythology, like Orontes or Achilles, around 12 to 13 feet tall,
Yeah.
in the range of where Og is, right? So,
Hmm.
but the dark-haired ones might be a little bit larger, and they're a different variety of giant with the size and the hair color. Still pale skin, still glowing eyes, still shining ones. And so the giants before the flood were, as I said, probably 20 to 40 feet tall. So now you see where I make part of my dividing line there.
Hmm.
Um, and so the horses were bigger before the flood because the giants were bigger.
Yeah.
So these were chimera beings. And in book two, I actually give a description of what we have coming down from the polytheists and what these unicorns looked like. And yes, they had a head of a horse with this giant horn, but they had multiple other animals that are through the rest of the body,
Yeah.
to put it mildly. They weren't cute and cuddly, and they could kill an elephant with one single gore of that horn.
Damn. So did people like King James, did he consider himself like part of that bloodline or a descendant of some
Yes.
of that bloodline?
Yes. So he brought Freemasonry with them, or it arrived just before them, but it arrived from Scotland. So Freemasonry is not Masonry.
Hmm.
Masonry is the old um, secret societies and knowledge. Freemasonry starts up just after the fall of the Knights Templar, with some of the adepts and Templars escaping to Scotland
Hmm.
to flee from the French king and Catholic oversight, because Scotland is not under Catholic oversight right now because Robert the Bruce was excommunicated for murdering his rival in a Catholic church, and they looked poorly upon that, so they excommunicated him. And so he's going to allow them to come in, and along with the De Bruces is the St. Clairs, which is the St. Clairs of France and Normandy. And St. Clair was the treaty uh, that was named for the settlement when the Norse, the Vikings, took Normandy in 910 to 912 AD, and they called it the Treaty of St. Clair. And so the Rollo bloodline from Odin changed their name to St. Clair at that point in time. Sinclair is just a transliteration of St. Clair.
Wow.
And so Sinclairs are going to take these under the, help of De Bruce, and Sinclairs are royals as well. They move over with the De Bruces along with some other families at the same time to Scotland. And they are going to utilize the Templars and put them into a new secret society that the Templars are going to run by 1317. And they're going to call that Freemasonry. And
Interesting.
then Robert the Bruce is going to develop the first visible Rosicrucian society in 1323.
Wow.
And the first time of the invisible ones of the Rosicrucians that we talked about earlier, when they were negotiating to try and put the Templars back into the Catholic churches in 1317 with the 33 invisible ones, who actually end up poisoning the Pope there and then having to go back underground.
Holy
Um,
cow.
so when we look at um, what's going on here with development of secret societies, you're going to see the Rosicrucians, the Royals at the top, decentralize the Templar organization. So they're going to create the Rothschilds, which was the Bauer family, to replace the banking arm. And each secret society that they create, like the Rosicrucians, like the Illuminati, like the Freemasons, are going to have specific agendas, and it's this decentralization within that trunk hierarchy that they like to call a thelemic tree. And so this is the organization that is spawned in England, but ancient masonry would still be there. And St.
Hmm.
Clair was one of the battle partners of Hugh de Payan in the time of the Crusades and the creation of the Knights Templar.
Hmm.
And then you have a St. Clair at the splitting of the elm that we talked about. Marie St. Clair, a female, wife of de Guiser at Guiser's castle, who is going to be a Grand Master of the Senior Order of the Priory of Sion as it splits away from the Knights Templar. So the Grand Masters of both orders uh, go back to 1118 with Hugh de Payan, but technically Godfrey de Bouillon would be the first Grand Master and sovereign of Jerusalem. But you have a splitting of the crown and the splitting of the Templar Order into the Junior Order, and the Senior Order would oversee the nominating of the kings of Jerusalem at that time and the Grand Masters and the direction of the Templars
And
until the splitting in 1188. So that's how you see Freemasonry merging with Royal Masonry. So when you see imageries of King James being initiated in a uh, a temple-like setting, that's just for show. He's been
hmm.
initiated as a royale since childhood, as a Mason,
Hmm.
and would be so far above adept level that you wouldn't be initiated as a lowly, not even first level adept in that setting. That's just just for public consumption.
Hmm.
And so he brings and or sends before either he or you know the king before have sent Freemasonry to with a beginning in England. So that's going to partner now up with Francis Bacon when King James comes to power.
Yeah.
And so yes, he looks at himself as this bloodline of an antichrist. I mean, would he like to be the antichrist? I think sure. And he writes three books about demonology that he's quite famous for as well.
Jeez. Yeah.
It's written as an apologetics for demonology or something to that effect. This is an individual that we have to understand who he is.
Hmm.
And as a royale, he is polytheist. And
Yeah.
when they swear an oath to a god, just like King Charles did, it's to a specific god of the Council of Gods at Mount Hermon that give them the divine right to rule, which King James exerted like most others didn't. But he
Hmm.
fully believed in that to the level that he thought he should control the whole world. And so that's why you have all of those passages that have unicorn and is raising that mythos and pedigree as preparation for him or one of his descendants to possibly be that unicorn, little horn of Antichrist.
Wow.
And I'm not saying that's the family that produces Antichrist because
Hmm.
all of the bloodlines want to produce a dragon Messiah.
Yeah. That is so interesting. So, like as he's kind of coming up with this new translation of the Bible, his I guess his own version, along I guess he has like a team of translators along with Francis
Yep,
Bacon.
yep.
Was that used to kind of control the world? Because through Shakespeare and the Bible, I guess the West was kind of defined and created
Yeah.
through a lot of that.
Yeah, so if you look at what Francis Bacon wrote, he wrote The New Atlantis.
Hmm.
And what he imagined was a world that um, had universal government and a universal religion, and a religion that was in perfect harmony with the sciences. So polytheism in the
Hmm.
sciences come out of polytheism in the mystery schools. And he named it the New Atlantis. Why? Because Atlas and his nine other kings, 10 of them, were trying to bring Enochian mysticism and world government through wars uh, to set up that same thing before the flood. So Atlas could be looked at like an antichrist type figure. Because
Hmm.
nothing is new under the sun. So what happened before the flood, it's got to be like the days of Noah that we're going to see in the end time. So that implies moving that back, there'd be at least one antichrist type figure in the antediluvian world. And
Hmm.
that's the imagery that they're projecting to set up. And that this is a society that's inheriting the knowledge of the Templars who wanted to create the new Babylon within the Roman Church. That was their goal, to create this universal religion
Hmm.
and then bring about their dragon Messiah. So as Bacon and Dee influencing the Royals or working in perfect partnership and vision, see England developing is they see that as a perfect opportunity with the new lands around the world to start advancing this new Nephilim world order, so to speak. And so what goes along with some of the exploration is the establishing of Freemason lodges in these new areas.
Yeah.
And then as it progresses into continental Europe, and these lodges are going to be used by Freemasonry, by the Illuminati, by the Rosicrucians to advance this cause. So you
Fascinating.
see multiple parts that are working together in that long-term plan. So it's hard to imagine how they saw they could do that in one lifetime, and I don't think they actually did. So I think it's more the bloodline they were trying to put in place for the future,
Hmm.
and it all worked in perfect harmony, so to speak. And so you would have coming across with the immigrants, not the first sons, but let's say there was six sons in a family with the larger families, you might send, four, five, and six into the New World, into specific areas, working through these lodges as they were establishing these lodges as new cities were being established or new townships. And each new township that established has a town square in it.
Hmm.
That's their town square. That's their legal right to govern over it. And if you look on a Masonic temple, they have the windows with this quadrant. It's like a cross. It puts the windows into four different areas. That's how your town square is divided. And typically, the original town square would have two legal buildings, one on the north and south axis, and then two churches that they control on the east and west axis for the original town square. And then they would dig underground, do tunnels, and all sorts of other things as well. And then you probably have a sacrificial site that's somewhere in the northwest quadrant by a water source, is how they would ideally like to place it. And if you go to most town squares, that's what you're going to see.
Yeah.
And most people never associate the town square other than, well, it's the center of the town. And so that's what, you should have something like that, but they don't see the influence over that. But that's how they're plotting their long-term plan
Hmm.
to bring this about. And so they're still not there, obviously. And
Yeah.
obviously it's taking way more time than they would have, this group would have anticipated, or probably all of the royals. The trouble is they're all rivals for the same family that's going to run the world. There can only be one, as in the old Highlander fiction and allegories
Hmm.
of, and so they work directionally together, but they're still rivals at the same time. So they become sometimes their own worst enemies in moving this along at a faster time.
Each city that pops up, there's within a year or so a
Yep.
Masonic lodge that's right
Yeah.
next to it, mid 1800s or whatnot.
Yep.
Sometimes even earlier than that. But
Yep.
yeah, it's a fascinating connection, seeing how far back that kind of goes. I saw it rumored getting into like more recent stuff within, I guess, the war in Iraq, then possibly finding Nimrod or Gilgamesh. Have you seen anything about that?
Yeah, there's a trail. It's hard to get a lot of detail on it. I
Hmm.
have a link that if people get a hold of me, I can send them. And um, it links back through Hillary Clinton um, and her office. And
Hmm.
she had a FOIA request for the details on the discovery of the tomb and the remnants and the DNA that were in there, and wanted the information on that.
Holy
So
cow.
yeah, um, I could bring the details of that up on my screen here, but yes, and I wanted to make sure I had. That's why I have it in a file,
Yeah.
is because and you just click on it. You don't get a lot of information because it's specific to that FOIA request, but it
Hmm.
does say um, what I'm talking about. Did you want me to bring that up and read
Oh
it?
yeah. Yeah, yeah. If you don't mind, that'd
Yeah,
be
it shouldn't
incredible.
should not take me more than 30 seconds, but
Yeah.
well, I got to get the codes right first. Oh, yeah, and it just brings veracity to this whole larger concept of what's going on in the world,
Hmm.
and that if people in high levels of government and power are interested in these ancient discoveries, what are they interested in it for? And are they wanting to recreate giants through DNA? Or did they want maybe some technology that they might thought that the sarcophagus had associated with it?
Hmm.
Um, and that's important because sarcophagus in the polytheist world in entertainment is used as a regeneration chamber to give longer life and to repair body parts or illnesses. So
Oh wow.
yeah, so I don't know whether people can see this. That's just what I have, and there's a link on there, and I'll just read what is
Okay.
on here.
Yeah.
And I got the official box here, and then I just had it in sort of larger writing. So it's got FOIA number F-2019, which would be the year 02110, and it's from Denitra de Senegar requesting documents pertaining to the resurrection chamber of Gilgamesh, the
Wow.
location of his body, and the location of the buried Nephilim. And that's dated on that note at 12/13/2018. There was another one that actually went back to 2015 that I once saw where Hillary was involved on it as well. That was released in a tranche of documents at towards the end of Obama's term, but I've not been able to find that one. But this is the one I was able to refine and keep a record of because I learned after that these things may just disappear after a while.
Yeah.
So I can send people that, and it takes you right to the FOIA site, and but you won't get the details of what was provided. It's just
Yeah.
following the track. And the point of the matter is that she wouldn't be requesting that information if there's not something to it. That's
Yeah.
what they found. And so it's on, and this release was on, and this is how far it gets buried in these tranches. Page 470 from the Department of State log in that date on 2018. So,
Yeah. I mean, Secretary of State, I believe she was.
yes.
Probably, I mean, even before that, obviously in the White House. Yeah, she obviously was heard about something that she was interested in and really trying to find it. That is absolutely wild. Have you come across any other like government documents and search for anything similar or?
No, because it's like looking for needles in a haystack, right?
Hmm.
You have to
Yeah.
be, it's like Googling something, or not Googling, but doing a word search. If you don't get
Hmm.
it spelling right or get
Yeah,
it,
it's
you
kind of
don't,
like the government sites that like you have to get the actual terminology correct to find, I
yes.
guess, what you're looking for. So, like some of the technology, do you see it kind of current day through some of like these orbs or UFO type phenomenon that's occurring?
Yeah, I think there's a connection there. And, when we look at the alien phenomena, that's going to become more and more of a uh, growing sort of concern. I don't think we're ever going to get full disclosure and full truth on it. I think
Hmm.
it's just part of the visible sort of hierarchy that's all leading us in the same direction. I talk about in book one the elementals, and these are a group of beings that are created by fallen angels before the flood. Either they survived or they created more of them again
Hmm.
after the flood. And with the elementals, there's like four different groups that are associated with basic elements of the world, like wind, fire, air. Each one has represents one of them. One of the groups is kind of fits in with the alien mythos and other things that are going on sort of within the earth. These are called salamanders. They're taller than humans and they're reptilian. So
Interesting.
yeah,
Yeah.
and then the three little groups are like you have mischievous ones like leprechauns, you have good-looking ones like pixies, you have ugly ones like trolls, three different groups. And this is a standard hierarchy and groupings around the world on all continents. Again, it's one of those inexplicable things that comes down through all the societies.
Hmm.
And that there's one specific group in the ugly ones called the gnomes, and they were responsible for the technology, the genealogy, and other knowledge um, as guardians. And they would come through fairy domens, portals, fairy mounds, through UFO, UAP type vehicles,
Yeah.
um, and from another dimension, and they would kidnap people and do sexual experimentation on. Likely needing some DNA regeneration is also part of the mythos. It is so identical to gray alien mythos that even the descriptions of these gnomes, which are called gray fairies,
Hmm.
are identical to what we see with the grays. And if people want to know kind of to get a visual, if people are familiar with the Stargate series with the Asgard, they would look like that, similar
Okay.
to
I'll have to,
that.
yeah, I'll have to search that.
Yeah, and so
Interesting.
again, now we have other links to the alien phenomena and some sort of hierarchy because these little ones are below the hierarchy in the occult of the salamanders, and
Hmm.
the giants are above that. And then there's other groups of beings as well as part of the visible ones. And so I think we're going to see more of this and using that as another segue to get us caught up on the technology to get us closer to the level that we need to be for the last 7 years.
Yeah, the salamander thing is fascinating. Have you seen that come across any like coat of arms throughout some of the lineage that kind of run Europe?
Yeah, so salamander comes up in inexplicable ways, and we don't know why. All we know
Hmm.
is if it becomes raised to a level, there's an important aspect to it. And if we look at the Tuatha De Danann, these are giants, both before and after the flood, and they're called the fair folk or the fairy folk. So
Hmm.
these little ones are also called fairies, right? And so in the Lord of the Rings, to show you what I'm talking about in terms of how they're going to show up and a distinction in it, you're going to have like hobbits and you're going to have dwarves, and the dwarves live in the ground and create the weapons for other beings. And in history, that's what the dwarves did. They made the weapons and lived in the ground, and they made weapons for the giants, right?
Hmm.
And so now we also have within the Lord of the Rings the noble white elf, right? And these ones are the Shea people, same name for the Tuatha De Danann. White
Hmm.
elves are different than dark elves. Dark elves are part of the little people. White elves is an allegory for the giants and the giant bloodline and the fairy aspect because they were fair-skinned fairy people. Also, the fairy is the matriarchal allegory of the bloodlines versus the dragon is the patriarchal allegory of the giants in terms of how they trace their genealogies. And so there's a picture people can Google called Riders of the Shea, Sidhe, and it's going to show you a depiction of Tuatha De Danann. They also, one of the horses, I think two horses in there have this gold helmet on with this unicorn horn on it. There's serpents and stuff all the way through it, and they look like the noble fairies in The Lord of the Rings.
Oh wow.
Yeah,
Holy
so
cow.
and of course that's just an antediluvian um, story. So
Yeah.
but it's done in that mythopoetic sort of style where their characters, their belief systems, their genealogies, and their history is encoded in a fictional story. It's kind of
Hmm.
like the Da Vinci Code.
Yeah.
It's their style of holding their ancient knowledge. And just so people know that we want to pay attention to this group of elementals because we actually get told of elementals in the New Testament. So in Galatians 4, 3, and 9, in association with fallen angels, that the elementals are the ones who enslave us in this world. And
Gotcha.
and then you get, if you take that back to the Greek, that's the Greek word stoichian. Now, stoichian can mean a basic element of the world, just as elements are named after a basic element of the world.
Hmm.
But basic elements of the world can't enslave us, right?
Yeah.
So Stoican is also translated, and a lot of times the translations are not consistent in the KJV Bible. You would think it would be translated as elemental all the way through, but strangely, we get rudiments in Colossians 2, 8, and 20. talking about the same beings, the same relationship to the fallen angels, but now they've used a different word. That's not uncommon to try and keep, I think, humans from making proper connections to what is written in the Bible. So, are there sort of other examples of that? Sure. And I get you could use a nuanced translation, but the translators said they don't apologize for their consistency or inconsistency of the translation,
Hmm.
and that they're more concerned more with an artistic style. So, for example, you might get the word tribulation, as in the Great Tribulation. That's in Matthew 24:21. But if you go to the parallel passage in Mark 13:19, that you
Hmm.
have this great tribulation not seen since creation, the word isn't tribulation, it's translated as affliction. But it's the
Interesting.
same word in Greek, which is thlipsis. And so you see that not affliction, but afflicted in Matthew 24:7, where the church is being afflicted in the last 7 years, but it doesn't say tribulation. It says
Hmm.
afflicted.
Yeah.
Um, and so there's not always a consistency of how it's being translated. That doesn't mean you ever have thlipses being translated for wrath or vengeance. That's orge and thumas in Greek, used for another application and another thing that's going on. Tribulation is not wrath. Tribulation, as it's defined in the New Testament, is provided, unfortunately, to the church by those who
Mhm.
rule this world. The wrath is is done by God for those who rule this earth, who bring tribulation on his people, the church,
Hmm.
and for the ungodly. There are two different terms.
Yeah.
But again, even you don't even have wrath out of Thumas and Orge being translated consistently in the same prophecy, because it can be vengeance at other times. And it's just like, it would be just so much easier if you had a more consistent translation. So do I find it odd that rudiment and elements coming from the same word, talking about the same beings being translated differently? No, I learned to accept that and to identify other MO consistencies to help me understand what's going on in the English translation out of Hebrew and out of Greek.
Have you looked into the mounds in America and
Yeah.
what was discovered within and maybe the Smithsonian cover-up of giant bones?
Yeah, so all connected. Um, so let's start with the giant bones. So I have a link I can send people if they want to get a hold of me. And
Cool.
yeah, obviously, I don't think it has all of them, and I didn't create the link, but it has a spreadsheet of discoveries of giant bones
Hmm.
that were recorded in newspaper stories between about 1850 and 1950. And so if you sort of click on it, you get sort of quick description of the size of the giants, where, newspaper. But what's unique about this link is that it has another link off to the far right in the Excel spreadsheet, that if you click on that, takes you to the actual newspaper story in the newspaper that it was printed, and you can read it for yourself.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And so it's got numerous ones of these. And within these stories, and as you do a little bit more research on it, there's two common stories that have a nexus point on it. So in the first case is that a set of bones are discovered in a cave, wherever, and they notify the local university,
Hmm.
and the university sends out their staff, and they document it all. And then they contact the Smithsonian, and the Smithsonian says, forward them to us and we'll take it from here. And then all records disappear.
Hmm.
The other story, what happens is that the Smithsonian is contacted directly. They come out, take the bones, take them back, and then all record disappears after that of
Yeah.
it. So there's a definite controlling of this history and information. So you just can't. I mean, I do not believe our ancestors were dimwits. They just had less technology,
Hmm.
just as we have more technology today than we did 10 years ago. I mean, there's no difference in us. And they were doing things with the technology that they had to record things. And those in control were doing things what they had control of. And with less technology, they actually, for a while, had more control, which is why they're trying to get control of all the technology to get all that control back again.
Hmm.
But they need the development of that technology. So it's still sort of working their plans. So we need to understand that they don't want us to know that the top two classes, the noble ones, the elite. Have you ever thought of that word elite?
Uh,
Elites?
yeah, not a whole lot.
Okay, well, the word it means this, and then I'll define the word a little bit differently.
Hmm.
And it's understood as a chosen person, a chosen one, and it's selected out of, and it's also defined as a group or a class of people having the greatest power and influence within a society, and a group of persons who, by virtue of position, education, genealogies, exercise control and power um, over the world, basically. And so, genealogy, what the heck is that doing in there? Right?
Yeah.
Now that word E-L, and then ite. So you like Israelites, right? So I think it actually should probably would be a leem, except that their bloods are diluted, so they've gone with the ite um,
Wow.
versus the I am like as a Nephilim, for example, or Rephaim. And El is the Hebrew word for an angel or a god.
Hmm.
That's who they believe they
Yeah.
are.
Holy cow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I've never heard it broke down like
Yeah,
that.
the offspring of the Elim. So,
Holy heck.
so when we look at how things are run in this world, we need to understand that. So, when we look at how little we know about the Serpent Mounds and other sites, because it's controlled by the Smithsonian and other groups,
Hmm.
and that it's only through dribbles and by sheer will are things coming out about these things that make those old North American sites akin to Middle East sites or European sites or to Central American sites. So, I mean, the serpent imagery is a worldwide imagery.
Hmm.
And the serpent mounds, where giant bones have been discovered, um, these serpent mounds have, and other First Nation sites have celestial alignments that are inexplicable. Where did they get the knowledge to do that?
Yeah.
They have the same type of sacred geometry. The serpent mounds do not seem to erode. There's some sort of technology in there that has been able to keep that in place for, thousands of years. So this
Interesting.
just seems to be either early post-Diluvian or antediluvian sites, just as we would see elsewhere around the world. And it's something that I'd like to see a lot more information on, research done on it. Not my specialty. I know L.A. Marzulli has done some research, significant research on that. But it is done in the same MO as other ancient sites around the world.
Hmm. Got a couple more questions if you don't mind.
Yep.
This is unrelated, but I was just going to get your thoughts on the recent tragic death of Charlie Kirk.
Yeah, it's certainly tragic for sure. Disappointing for sure on a level that I know I'm understating. I've never met him, but he and I never followed him either. So,
Hmm.
um, but he did some things that most people weren't able to do. I mean, he brought conservatism back to the campuses to a certain degree, and was, you know, able to convince many of the young people. He started a movement. So within the world of how this works, you have rivals that we talked about, and it's called dualism within polytheism. And I don't want to impugn Charlie in any sort of way, but I'm just
Hmm.
give people an understanding of how things work in the backgrounds. And so you can have white hats and dark hats. You have white magic, black magic. You have good witches, bad witches. You have good kings and queens and evil kings and queens. That's their good versus evil. That's the micro level within that they're, even though they seem poles apart and they have a different approach. And one says they have the better consideration of humanity and their preservation than the other one does, which just wants to wipe them out. They worship the same pantheon of gods and they have the same destination.
Hmm.
So we want to be careful of that. So trying to figure out who are the white hats that we would like to say, you know, have our better interests at heart, and who are just manipulating us and who are actually non-polytheists. Let's define it that way. And truly have the heart of, the interest of humanity at heart is hard to know. So you can have different forces rising up to eliminate people. So if this, let's say he was actually part of the craft, well, and he was part of the white hats, just to use an example, it would not be unusual if they saw that was going to have too much of an influence that one of the same belief system might take them out. Or it could be both sides of that same system that saw what was coming and they didn't want to have that in place and they worked together. So what do I mean by that? Well, establishment political Democrats, established Republicans are the same coin.
Hmm.
So outside that realm, which where Charlie would and his movement would have fell, would be opposing both of the establishments, just as Trump did. Well, it doesn't matter whether you're a fan of Charlie Kirk or Donald Trump. It just understand what they did. John F.
Hmm.
Kennedy got outside the establishment,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
And it's an MO of taking people out, because what the white and black hats like to do is control both sides as poles apart and then cattle herd everybody in a direction. So we have to be careful as to who we think are white hats. Are they really after our better interest, or are they even worse because they're telling us they want to help us, but they really do not? And when Trump was first elected, and you had all of this stuff about Q, and Q was going to do this and help him do that. And I'm going, well, have you ever thought about that letter Q? Well, people were saying, well, what do you mean? Well, I said, are you familiar with white hats and dark hats? And a lot of people knew that, but if they didn't, I would explain it to them. I said, well, Q is the K sound in ancient Hebrew. So if you are a mystical Judaic person, a polytheist, then you would understand Kabbalah and the Cabal spelled with a Q, not a K.
Interesting.
Now, and so my comment back to them, so if this Q organization, which is sort of a secret kind of organization, which has the MO of polytheism,
Hmm.
and they like to utilize letters, words, names, allegories that they know people don't understand. Do they really have our interests at heart, or are they cattle herding us? That's what people need to ask about these things. And they will tend to typically tip their hat. I can't say Charlie showed any of those white hat indications. Some people might say, well, I think he was Catholic and blah, 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 blah. But I
Hmm.
didn't see, and I'm not trying to say Catholics are anti-Christian. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying
Yeah.
some people might say that.
Hmm.
Um, so I think it's not what he was promoting was not the agenda that the establishment, those who run this world, want to see. And we saw what happened with Trump, even though he comes out of that establishment
Hmm.
and from the Democrats. We saw how the whole world rose up against him
Yeah.
and tried to stop him, and somehow he was able to overcome. That doesn't mean I believe he's a true Christian. I'm just
Yeah.
we'll wait. We'll have to wait and see. He's done a number of things early in his term that are giving me concerns. But
Hmm. Yeah, it did seem like something everybody wants to make it political, but to me, when you murder somebody like that so publicly, it seems like it crosses the line where it's like more spiritual and you're like stepping in
yeah,
over a
you're
type of
it's
will
an
that shouldn't be.
intercession of a
Yeah,
yeah.
which is extremely sad, whether whatever side you're on. But my last question I love to ask my guests is, what do you think happens to you when you die?
Well, I think the Bible's fairly clear on that.
Hmm.
So, what the Bible tells me over and over and over and over and over and over is, I stopped counting how many times because it was just in the hundreds, and I just was, okay, I get it. I'm not going to go through this just to have a number.
Hmm.
I would like to know the number, but the Bible over and over tells us that we go to sleep when we die. And even when Lazarus was raised from the dead, he was right. Jesus was talking about him, bringing him up out of the sleep. So our body and our soul, that is part of this world. In the New Testament, we're told there's spirit, soul, and body. And Ecclesiastes 10 tells us that when we die, our spirit goes back to heaven. Our spirit comes from heaven when we're born and merges
Hmm.
with the soul and the body, which is of this world. When we're resurrected, we will receive new bodies in the image of the body that Jesus created, which was something new when he was resurrected, a body that could go back and forth between dimensions in heaven. Whereas fallen angels have to create their own oiketerion, a dwelling place for the spirit in the physical world to take a physical form because they're spiritual beings. So, where do we Christians go when we die? Or humans go when we die? Our spirit goes back to heaven in a sleep state, waiting for whichever resurrection based on what we've chosen to do in our life that will be resurrected. And there is a sequence of resurrections as we're informed both in Daniel 12 and in the New Testament. Daniel 12 is a separate resurrection that should not be confused with Christian resurrections. Let me leave the audience with this
Hmm.
because
Of course.
one of the difficulties with linking the Old Testament with the New Testament is the New Testament was recorded in Greek and the Old in Hebrew. So we don't get the word
Yeah.
matchups like I can take from the book of Psalms back, to the same Hebrew word in Genesis.
Hmm.
But you get words that are similar, and that's the best we can do. So when we're talking about tribulation, thlipses, persecution, it can also be translated as, and or trouble. And when we have Jacob's trouble in Jeremiah 37, in the time of the second Exodus in the last 3.5 years, that Israel will be saved out of, and just I won't explain much more on that than expect Israel to become visible again. They are the northern kingdom, Judah is the southern kingdom, and they'll be called back by name. So they're going to remember who they are,
Hmm.
as what was recorded in Old Testament prophecy and the Holy Covenant. And that word trouble shows up in Daniel 1 that I talked about. This is the time of trouble. And that's the Hebrew word sarah, Tsarah. And it means persecution, tribulation, trouble, same. It's the cognate word for tribulation that's used in the Greek in the New Testament. So Daniel 12 and Jeremiah 37 lines up in the last 3.5 years, right? So
Hmm.
that's one of the ways when you get really deep, if you want to go that deep, you can start to say, how do I connect with some certainty things that are said in the Old Testament and the New Testament?
Hmm.
And to that point, people will say, well, we don't get giants in the end time. but we're dealing with different language and we're dealing with the descendants and their bloodlines have been deleted. But in Revelation, we get some interesting terms that we should probably try and understand.
Mm-hmm.
And these are the kings of the earth, that are and great men of the earth, and the mighty men of the earth, as it's talking about the noble elite that we've defined.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the old language of Indo-Aryan, the language of the giants, the word that was used to describe large, tall, big, mighty, vast is the Indo-Aryan word meg, M-E-G.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the word that is produced into the Greek from the source word meg is mega and megastranes. And each are meaning kind of a similar thing. And so mega is great in stature, great in age, great as in weight, great as in mass, great as in height. And megastranes um, also produces grandes, but megastranes is meaning basically the same thing as in greatness as in meg, because it's rooted out of that as well. But grandes means lords, nobles, and very great, the greatest, and a chief and a leader. Okay, so these are the words that are using to describe these individuals in Greek in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
These are the same words that would be for Gibor or Gibborim as these mighty warrior ones. And so when we look in the end time in Joel 1 and 2 and 3, in the Gog War of Joel 1 and 2, and Armageddon of Joel 3, we have these mighty men, which are the kings of the earth,
Mm-hmm.
that are talked about. That is your sort of cognate sort of correlation. So what I'm trying to encourage people to do is to dig deeper into this sort of aspect to try and bring home the Greek translation to the Hebrew translation and get a better understanding. But for me, it's pretty clear that the great and mighty men, megas and megastranes, that is being used in Revelation in relationship to the noble elite and the royals is the direct relationship that we need with end time prophecy of the mighty ones.
Wow. It's a fascinating connection right there. Would you like to shout out any social media or website where people can get your
Yeah, so
work?
the best way to get a hold of me is through my website, the Genesis6conspiracy.com, the number 6conspiracy.com. I'm running 2 to 3 months behind on email, so do be patient. So if you want some more information on some of the things that we talked about or want to ask me a question on something, I do try and answer them in order. So, and I'm trying to bring down the response time, but that's the best way to get a hold of me. And on that website, there's a contact the author. If people are interested and want to know a little bit more about me or the books that I've written, I have a generous excerpt of all 98 chapters on, and there's a preface and an epilogue, but I didn't put those up there. All 98 chapters of book one and all 84 chapters of book two. It's a small sampling, even though it's a large excerpt of a very large book. So it'll give you a good indication whether or not those books are for you and you want to learn a little bit more of that. And if you wanted to get a signed copy, and the only donations I accept is through the sale of books, so I don't accept funds any other ways unless I speak at a conference. And if they make money, then I'll accept money for that. But if you wanted to get a signed copy and support me, you can go to the Buy Now page. And on there in the menu, you're going to have Buy Page 1, Buy Page 2, and Buy Page 3. And page 1 is book 1, page 2 is book 2, page 3 is the bundling page. Now, on each of the buy pages, you can get discounts for buying multiple books.
Mhm.
But to bundle both with the discount, you have to go to buy page 3. Now, if you make a mistake, you order 2 books of Genesis 1, but you wanted one of book 2 because they're on separate pages, just send me an email. I'll ship you one of each. They're the same price, so it
Mhm.
doesn't really matter in terms of that. But just that's how it's set up. There's a page for Canada, there's a page for the US, and there's a page if you live anywhere else in the world. And if you wanted to link over to barnesandnoble.com, there's a link for that. Amazon.com, Amazon.ca takes you right to the books as they're listed on Amazon. The books are also available on most online bookstores and other bookstores, depending on time of year and the chain and things like that. And if you wanted to get a digital version, you can link over from the Buy Now page right to Amazon for the Kindle version of each book, and also the Audible version of both books are linked over to Amazon Audible as well. So that's the easiest, fastest way to get a hold of me or to order my books.
Awesome, man. Definitely going to pick up a couple of the signed copies for sure. And I really, really appreciate your time. You're one of my favorite guests. You were a guest that I envisioned when I started the
Yeah,
podcast. So I really, really appreciate you, man.
you're quite welcome. My pleasure.